Hello and welcome to the Unreal Resilience podcast. My name is Kate and this is episode 1. And I am already regretting picking that name because it is a little bit of a tongue twister. Unreal Resilience. But I'm going to just go with it. I'm too far in. So I guess I just start out with introducing myself. I have been on the internet for maybe about 8 years in different capacities. I have a YouTube channel and an Instagram and a TikTok that have all been about weight loss and health. And I've posted to those places with varying degrees of consistency. You might have also seen me. I told a story about how I was scammed in 2019 by a college friend, and I might get into that story at some point on this podcast, but I told that story on TikTok and it got a lot of views, so you might know me from there. But anyway, who I am is not important to this podcast because this is going to be about other people. I'm starting this podcast because I have a lot of anger and resentment and feelings about the presidency and the state of affairs in the country and in the world, which if you are happy with what's happening in the country, you are still so welcome here. I'm very happy for you that you are feeling good. This is not going to be a political podcast, but it's going to be about telling people's stories of resilience and strength because I think that those stories are needed right now. And so I want to tell uplifting stories. Maybe they're not always uplifting because to have resiliency and strength automatically implies that there's going to be trials and hardships as well. So maybe they're depressing stories, but they're stories of strength and resiliency and hope. So that brings me into today's topic, the first story of the podcast, and that is of a fisherman who was lost at sea for 438 days and survived to tell his story. And I could really honestly tell you this story without any notes because I heard this story in 2020 and ever since then I haven't stopped thinking about it. It's an incredible story of survival. I am going to use notes though because there's a lot of good quotes in here. So, on November 17th, 2012, a Salvadorian fisherman named José Salvador Alvarenga went into the Pacific Ocean off the coast of Mexico. His usual fishing partner wasn't available, so he found a day worker, Ezequiel Cordoba, who is a 22-year-old who had no deep sea fishing experience, and they had never spoken, let alone worked together. But he offered him a day job and they went fishing together. And as soon as they hit the deep ocean, a massive storm hit. And for the next 5 days, they were at the mercy of the ocean with winds over 50 miles per hour, huge waves flooding the boat, and their radio and their motor were damaged. Quote, Cordoba at times refused to bail water and instead held the rails with both hands, vomiting and crying. He had signed up to make $50. He was capable of working 12 hours straight without complaining and was athletic and strong. But this crashing, soaking journey, he was sure that the tiny craft would shatter and sharks would devour them. He began to scream. So that kind of sets the mood. Obviously, being at sea in a crazy storm in a boat with very little safety measures is a terrifying nightmare. So during the storm, Alvarenga managed to call his boss on a two-way radio and request help, and then the battery of the radio died. And it was the last anyone heard from him for 438 days. So Alvarenga's boss organized a search party and they went out to look for them, and they had to call it off after 2 days because the storm was so bad. And Alvarenga and Cordoba drifted further and further west into the Pacific Ocean. The boat was a 23-foot fiberglass skiff with no roof. When they left, they had gasoline, water, bait, hooks, line, harpoon, knives, 3 buckets for bailing, a mobile phone, a GPS that was not waterproof, a half-charged two-way radio, several wrenches, and 200 pounds of ice. They also had nearly 1,000 pounds of fresh fish, which were making the boat top-heavy and unstable in the storm, so they had to throw them into the ocean, along with the gasoline and the ice. Waves washed away most everything else. Alvarenga strung 50 buoys from the boat as a makeshift sea anchor, providing more drag and stability. So after the storm, you guys, they had a machete, 1 fish hook, and an onion. They also had a styrofoam box that held the fish, which was about the size of a refrigerator. And when I heard this, I thought that both of them could fit into it, like a great big refrigerator box. But I saw a picture of it and it looks like literally only one person can fit. And it looks like an ice box, like a cooler. It's very small. But they used that to protect themselves from the sun. And they also had pieces of the broken motor, which I don't think I saw this before, but during the storm, their motor was also broken. So they do eventually find 72 bottles in the ocean. There was a lot of garbage that they were able to secure to collect rainwater. And they also find a plastic gas jug where they're able to store water. So these two strangers are in this tiny boat through this crazy storm. And then they have 5 days of zero rain, which also almost kills them. Quote, I was so hungry that I was eating my own fingernails, swallowing all the little pieces. He ate jellyfish, scooping them up in his hands and swallowing them whole. It burned the top part of my throat, but it wasn't so bad. After roughly 14 days at sea, it finally rained. So they had set up a rain catchment system. And so once it finally rained, they were able to collect clean water, which is what they do for the rest of the trip. And if they can't get clean water, they drink turtle blood. And when they can't get that, they have to drink their urine. So while they're relatively close to the land, they're able to catch some fish and turtles. As they swim close to the boat, they actually just grab them and pull them onto the boat. But as they're getting further and further out into the sea, there's less fish and turtles, and they start relying on catching birds. They find these seabirds and the birds are tired, so they land on the boat. And at first they're alert and then they eventually fall asleep, and then they grab their legs and pull them into the boat, and then they break their wings so they can keep them alive on the boat and have a food ration. They would have 20 to 30 birds alive with them on this little tiny boat. Obviously, they're figuring out all these ways to stay alive and work with the resources that they have, but there's also a lot of free time. There's not a lot to do. And so Alvarenga said, we would talk about our mothers and how badly we had behaved. We asked God to forgive us for being such bad sons. We imagined if we could hug them, give them a kiss. I'm gonna cry. We promised to work harder. So they would not have to work anymore. But it was too late. Oh my gosh, I'm seriously getting emotional. Okay, so at this point, I want to tell you a little bit about both of these men. They say there's no such thing as a perfect victim, and I guess Alvarenga fits that bill. 13 years earlier, he had abandoned a girlfriend and his parents and an infant daughter in El Salvador, and he snuck away to Mexico. And in Mexico, he became a fisherman, obviously, but he also gained a reputation of a big partier. And it says he loved women, parties, food, and drugs. So partying, whatever, but abandoning your daughter isn't a good thing. But that will come up later. Cordoba, on the other hand, who was the younger of the two, was the opposite. He was an evangelical Christian. He was a God-fearing, church-going man. And actually, this is a really weird part of the story, which I wasn't sure if I should include because it just kind of creeped me out. But apparently someone in Cordoba's congregation had some sort of vision and told him that they knew he was going to die at sea, which I don't know what to think about that. But despite the differences with these two men, they were able to become very close while they were on this boat together. They would pass time by singing together. They would also fantasize about airplane food from the airplanes that were flying above them. And Alvarenga found purpose in taking care of Cordoba. He would tell him these intricate stories about food, and they would kind of get lost in these stories and pass time by daydreaming. At about Christmas time, they were able to decipher like how long they were on the boat by watching the moon. But Cordoba eats a bird that they had caught, and he gets suddenly extremely violently sick. And they find inside of the bird that he ate a yellow snake that's super poisonous. And Cordoba almost dies from this. But unfortunately, after this incident, Cordoba becomes fearful of eating, and eventually he stops eating altogether. Cordoba begins to decline physically and mentally. Alvarenga tries to feed him tiny chunks of meat, and Cordoba clenches his mouth. He's given up, and he eventually dies in Alvarenga's arms. Quote, I propped him up to keep him out of the water. I was afraid a wave might wash him out of the boat, and I cried for hours. So after he died, Alvarenga kept his body in the boat and was planning on keeping it to give to his family once he arrived at shore. But after a couple of days, he started talking to the body, and he started imagining the body talking to him and telling him how sweet death was. And so, fearing for his sanity, he decided that he needed to give him a burial at sea. And so he washed his feet, and then he took his clothes, which would be useful to him, and then he put him into the water. Quote, "What could I do alone, without anyone to speak with? Why had he died and not me? I had invited him to fish. I blamed myself for his death." So you guys, imagine this is 10 weeks into the journey, and he is out at sea for 14 months. So the vast majority of the time he's alone. But he took the skills that he had been implementing on Cordoba of caretaking onto himself. Mainly, he started telling himself stories. Quote, Alvarenga let his imagination run wild in order to stay sane. He imagined an alternative reality so believable that he would later say, with total honesty, that alone at sea, he tasted the greatest meals of his life and experienced the most delicious sex. He was mastering the art of turning his solitude into a fantasia-like world. He started his mornings with a long walk. He would stroll back and forth on the boat and imagine he was wandering the world. By doing this, he could make himself believe that he was actually doing something, not just sitting there, thinking about dying. Alvarenga insulated himself from the bleak reality. For over a year, Alvarenga drifted alone, surviving day by day. He kept track of time by counting the phases of the moon. He saw about 20 separate container boats, but none spotted him. And actually, I use a lot of different sources for this episode, and in one of the sources it says that at one point a boat literally drifted right next to him, and he thought he was going to get run over, and there was 3 fishermen on the back of the boat who just waved at him and did nothing to help him. And in my mind, I'm like, is there a possibility that he could imagine that? Because that is literally insane. I don't know how that can be true, but that was in one of the articles that I read. At various points, Alvarenga did seriously contemplate ending his life. He did credit his mother and his Catholic upbringing to not choosing that, but he also talked about his daughter, and he had this desire to make it through this experience so he could go home and become a good father. As people have looked into this story, they say another key factor of his survival is his sense of humor. He would talk to the ocean. He would say, "Poor ocean, you must be so tired of carrying me for so long. Why don't you just put me down on a beach?" He would lecture the birds and tell them they shouldn't have flown so far away from the shore. And he also picked one of his favorite birds that he had caught in his boat, and he kept him as a pet for a long time. And also, he would play soccer games with the birds. He would make a line down the middle of the boat, and then he would get a puffer fish as a ball, and then he would pretend the birds were playing soccer against each other. When he was starving and couldn't find food, he would eat wood pulp from the boat. He would also eat his beard and his fingernails. At one point, he seriously contemplated cutting off his pinky to eat it, but he didn't because he was afraid of bleeding to death. So Alvarenga was lost at sea for 438 days, and he started to notice that the wildlife was changing in the ocean, and he started smelling organic smells, and because of this, he knew he was getting close to some sort of land. In January of 2014, he spots an island, which, can you just imagine? As he floats closer and closer to the island, he cuts off the tail of buoys that are following the boat. He jumps into the water and he paddles like a turtle, he said, to the beach, and he drifts in like a piece of driftwood. He's left face down in the sand, and he said he held a handful of sand like it was a treasure. He had landed on a very small island at the southern tip of the Marshall Islands, which is one of the most remote places on Earth. If he would have missed this island, he would have been drifting north of Australia, possibly continuing another 3,000 miles until he reached the Philippines. I'm not seeing the distance. I think that his total trip was about 6,000 miles at sea. So 2 local residents found him naked, clutching a knife and shouting in Spanish. Emmy and Russell, who were the only 2 inhabitants of the island, found him. They said, "As I'm looking across, I see this white man there. He is yelling. He looks weak and hungry. My first thought was, this person swam here. He must have fallen off a ship." Alvarenga only spoke Spanish, and I'm not sure what they spoke. They didn't They spoke some sort of local dialect. I should have looked that up. But anyway, Alvarenga wrote, "Even though we did not understand each other, I began to talk and talk. The more I talked, the more we all roared with laughter. I'm not sure why they were laughing, but I was laughing because I was saved." And so they fed him pancakes, and then they got a hold of authorities that came and picked him up. He was taken to a hospital, and he had lost over 50 pounds. His vital signs were good, with the exception of especially low blood pressure. He had swollen ankles. He had trouble walking. He was put on an IV drip for dehydration. And I also heard that he had parasites from eating basically raw food for over a year. And apparently he didn't get scurvy because eating that much meat from the ocean had enough vitamin C. But for some reason, I went through a phase where I was obsessed with scurvy, but he did not get scurvy. So he was treated at the hospital until he had enough strength to travel, and then he was flown back to El Salvador on February 10th. So at the time of his rescue, he had not been in touch with his family for over 8 years. His parents actually assumed that he was dead before he went missing. So they were overjoyed to discover that he was still alive. His father prayed for him the whole time he had been missing, and his daughter, upon hearing that her father had been found, said that after he returned home, the first thing I will do is hug and kiss him. And also, back in Mexico, his old boss wanted him to return to his fleet and work for him. But instead, he decided to move back to his childhood home in El Salvador to fulfill a promise he had made while he was on the boat. He went back to become a good father to his daughter. When he was strong enough, he traveled to Mexico to fulfill a promise to Cordoba, and he met with Cordoba's mother. He sat with her for 2 hours, answering all of her questions. After he was rescued, Alvarenga was still in shock for months. He developed a deep fear of not only the ocean, but of sights of water, which, valid. I mean, he slept with his lights on and needed constant company. He obviously also got a lot of media attention, which he didn't like and tried to avoid. And he also got a lot of people questioning the validity of this story. But I mean, it was proven to be true. He passed the lie detector test. There were dozens of witnesses that saw both of the men leave shore, and they also heard his SOS call. His supervisor confirmed the registration number of the boat he had washed up on shore in was the same boat that had left the port on January 17th, 2012. Tom Armbruster, the United States ambassador to the Marshall Islands, acknowledged that it seems impossible for someone to survive at sea for 13 months, but that it's also hard to imagine how someone might arrive on Elbin out of the blue. So Alvarenga eventually does 40 interviews with Jonathan Franklin, and together they write the book 438 Days, An Extraordinary True Story of Survival at Sea. Some of the quotes today I took from that book. And to close it out, the book says, "For 438 days, he lived on the edge of sanity. I suffered hunger, thirst, and extreme loneliness, and didn't take my life. You only get one chance to live, so appreciate it." And that is the incredible survival story of José Salvador Alvarenga and his 438 days at sea. I think this podcast is just going to get better because I'm going to get more comfortable talking to a microphone. But if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. This is on YouTube as well as anywhere you find podcasts. I also set up a Patreon if you're interested, but I don't know what I'm going to do over there yet. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks so much for listening to my very first podcast episode. I appreciate you, and I will see you next week. Bye.